Hello. So I'm just going to show our normal intro slide and of course our antitrust policy notice. We show the antitrust policy at the beginning of every meeting. You'll find the full policy on our website, and if you're from a Linux Foundation member company, you can contact our counsel Andy Updegrove with any questions. Right, straight to business. Our playbook for medium companies looks like it's ready. I'm going to put the link into the chat in case you need it. This playbook is one of three. We're having playbooks for small, medium, and large companies. The idea is to have the first playbook for the medium company released on December 16th at the Open Compliance Summit. Looking at this playbook, it's not long. This medium company one, I think it's, let me check, 1, 2, 3, 4 pages long. And the idea is to have a description of a company that is general enough that people can relate to it, but specific enough so you can see what people in the company are doing. We have a situation with the medium company where 3 people are going to work together: a senior engineer, a legal expert, and someone from management. These 3 people are going to work together in a virtual open source program office. And the idea is that they will meet to analyze the existing policy, processes, and records. Then they will have a review. They will proceed basically to check if the processes are consistent throughout the company. And if not, they will advise management to align the processes. If the processes are consistent, they will get the Open Chain self-certification questionnaire. The engineer will check engineering department, how close their current policy, processes, and records work with the questionnaire. The legal expert will do the same for the legal department, and the management representative will check if the executive team's work meets that too. Once they have that, they will be able to say that they need to align the processes if they don't match, and do this using the questionnaire. So then they make a report for management about how they think the company can use the questionnaire. And they go to the departments, engineering department, legal department, and management team with an outline of what needs to be done and a timeline. Our recommendation is that this should be as short as possible. They should look for having something basic working in each department rather than making something perfect that takes too long. The OSPO holds meetings at the midpoint and end point of the implementation timeline for each department. And they want to support and encourage the departments, and they want to keep the management team informed of progress in case the timeline needs to be changed. Right, and once that's done, they have a special workshop to check the results against the questionnaire. If everything matches, they tell management that self-certification is complete. If the results do not match, they go back to step 6 and repeat. And then they have a review every 18 months to make sure that they meet the final requirement of the specification to double check if everything is okay every 18 months. And that's basically it. Does that sound roughly okay to you, or is it missing something that we really should have?
I think, like last time, has this been verified with real work that has been done?
A very good question.
By an AI company?
Yes, the Japanese work group is currently reviewing it to check if it matches their processes.
Okay.
So their review is happening now. They started, I think it was Friday. So maybe we'll have some results before the end of this week.
Yeah.
And I asked the Japanese team, especially just to focus on whether this was pretty much exactly what they'd done or were missing something. The companies I expect to get feedback from are Toshiba, Sony, Fujitsu.
And those are medium-sized companies?
They're group companies in each case, so they have medium-sized companies inside. Just by way of example, I think Toshiba has over 300 companies. I know Hitachi has over 1,000. But a lot of them are smaller due to the way it works in Japan.
Yeah, just thinking like, the whole umbrella of Toshiba, I don't know, they make ships and nuclear power plants and who knows what. So like, I wouldn't call that small company.
No, not the group company.
Or medium even.
Massive multinational. So it was different with Toyota because Toyota is much more kind of centrally controlled. So when it came to Toyota, oh wow, they started with OpenChain, and I think that there was an informal plan that Toyota would become conformant after 3 years. And that's exactly what they did. But I mean, we have a large company, but I think we need a massive company for something like Toyota. So Helio, welcome on board, and Valentina as well. So just to bring you fully up to speed, we have 3 playbooks, of which we're only seeking to finish one by December 16th. And the one we want to finish is Medium Company. It is a 4-page structure with a 6-step plan for a medium company to have a virtual OSPO and to go from assessing current practices through to using the OpenChain self-certification questionnaire and conforming their company. Last time we had a meeting on this, Jari made the very good point that it's all very well to have personas like we have and steps, but it needs to show the experience of real companies. Last week, the Japanese, one of the work teams, had a meeting, and on Friday, they had a look at the document, and they're going to check if the personas and if the steps match the kind of activity they had with their OpenChain conformance or their open source programs in various parts of their company. And to Jari's point, what we have right now are some massive companies looking at this, but they know that the medium company size is the one we need to shoot for. And because in Japan, they are umbrellas, and actually most of our companies are relatively small under the umbrella. They can do that. Sebastian, welcome. So the thing we have to do now is basically, if you see something that is terrible, please leave a comment. If you see something missing, we could make a note. You don't have to fill it out, but we can ask the Japan team to help fill that out, or so on and so forth. So I'm just going to pause here for a couple of minutes to give people time to look at the Medium document. I'm putting the link into the chat again so people can just assess it. And I will come back
Ah.
Oh, we both did it. Cool. I will
Yeah.
come back at 5 minutes from now. So let's do a quick review of the medium company for 5 minutes. And if you see something missing, let me know.
Well, while kind of going through this, is the reason why we talk about virtual OSPO and not just OSPO?
Yes. Part of the feedback I had was that a lot of the companies that aren't very significant, that aren't multinationals, are resource constrained. So their OSPOs tend to be part-time virtual.
Okay.
It's the opposite with Google or Microsoft, where they have dedicated resource.
Hi, did the meeting freeze?
The part about in the self-certification questionnaire,
Yeah.
the part which says, "Do you have a process?" Sorry, do you have a documented procedure? Where is
It's
it?
going to appendices 1. Do you know what section you're having a looking at?
Yeah, it was the one about having a process for responding to here we are, section 2. Do you have a documented procedure for receiving and responding to open source compliance inquiries?
Yes.
Is that a public procedure that you might publish on a website, or is this internal?
We usually find it to be 2 directions, public and internal. So maybe we should explicitly call that out, huh?
Yeah, I think that's just something that I stood out to me, because the other things are like program roles is obviously internal, and
Right.
Compliance Directory is obviously external, but that one in the middle is a bit more.
Good catch. Let me just put that comment in there.
Well, there's some advantage in being new to this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. Now, essentially, the reason that probably is there is because most companies tend to have a catch-all address for open source inquiries, but there's no reason that companies would follow that path. They could do something completely different. So being explicit seems to make natural sense. Oh, interesting comment. Yes. Can we make a chart with the key requirements of each license that appears in the project? Yes, that's an interesting question. I believe that there are some documents out there that show license requirements. I'm going to search for that. Now, we can't describe the license requirements in a way that we can't say what the license requirements are because the project cannot take the responsibility for interpretation. But there are resources that show license requirements and have matrices of license requirements. So I'm going to search for that, and we can certainly point at resources. If the resource is public domain, we could also include it as an appendix.
Yeah, I think I'll have one. I'll post it in the Zoom chat. I'm sure you're familiar with it, Shane. The EU Join Up Licensing Assistant has a number of is a table much like that.
Oh, great. So there's an EU one. That's very useful. I'm just going to grab that link and put it in our chat. Oh, that's very nice. And yeah, what's interesting here is that Sang Junxia said that she might be able to do one in China.
Yeah, that would be good. We had a discussion about this in one of the SPDX GitHub repositories, and so I'm looking through that to find what we came up with.
Of course, I vaguely recall that, but forgive me, I have no idea where it is.
Yeah, I'll post the general GitHub issue in the Zoom chat, and within that, there are a number of interesting things. The double open configuration project was one, yes. Which had machine readable data for that.
So double open had machine readable data on license requirements. Okay. Excellent. We have the potential for some license analysis from CAICT in China. This was machine readable.
Yeah, the double open was machine readable, and the EU one was human readable.
Yes. Nice. That's interesting. So we now potentially have the double open machine readable. We have the EU version, and we are potentially going to have some information from CAICT if it's not too much work. And this is important, just in case there's anyone on the call who isn't super familiar with the cross-border issue. License interpretation changes in different countries. So, thanks, Jerry. Jerry just flagged the other person. Oops, wrong one. Hey, Sammy, welcome on board.
Hi, sorry I was late. It was on another call, which overran.
Now Zoom won't let me copy Nico's address. No problem at all. So I'll just let you know where we are. We are going through the medium company playbook. It's 4 pages long. And we basically seem to be ready. Our Japanese colleagues are going to give us feedback about whether this playbook matches their lived experience. And that's something that maybe, Sammy, you could contribute, not now, but if you could have a look at this playbook and assess how realistic it seems for a company that has thousands of employees, if this looks like it matches the ARM story.
Sure, I'd be more than happy to do that.
That's super. I'm just going to put the direct link to the medium company playbook into the chat so you have it. So we have small, medium, and large company. In practice, so far we're thinking large company means tens of thousands of employees and very large multinational reach. So we'd be looking at sort of the Siemens or the Toshibas of the world, where you're looking at about 100,000 employees. The medium company, we don't have a set size, but basically we're trying to think of a company that's likely to have a virtual OSPO as opposed to dedicated staff resources, and how they pull that together and do their assessment. Just so you catch up on what we were talking about immediately before, we were talking about license descriptions. So we just opened a little thread here about the key requirements of various licenses. And we were provided with information about the EU assessment of various license terms and the existence of double open having machine readable license requirements. And bear in mind, what we're looking at here are meant to be examples, not prescriptive. And we fully expect them to be different between the different resources. And we also had, initially this was brought up by Sang Junxia, and she also said that she might be able to try for some license interpretations in China as well.
I'd also like to add that the OSI's license data, a machine-readable API, has been resurrected. So in the future, we might see more involvement in that with extra metadata being included.
That would be quite useful. And I think in Germany, we have OSADL. I'm just going to search for that and see if I can find it.
OSADO, yes.
Yeah, they did some license requirements, I think, somewhere.
No, they do a lot, actually. They have a very complete setup there for this.
Does anyone have a link to it? I'm just searching Google. Okay, here we go. Maybe the license checklists, I think, would be the thing. They've done a lot of licenses there, if I recall correctly. Okay, and here we go as well with the open source readable information about the OSI licenses. Thank you, Sebastian.
Well, I'll pass that thanks on to Gary O'Neill, who's been doing lots of great work in helping that get restarted again.
I imagine that looking at this material, one of the lighthouses might be this EU one to show how there's strong guidance cross-border from a non-commercial entity political side.
One thing I noticed with the EU side, though, is that there's no obvious way of adding licenses to this. So I don't know if they have a mailing list or something where people can suggest additions? If not, I think it would be a good idea.
I'm just going to test the compare list on this and see what happens. Oh, that's nice. Ooh, that's pretty good.
That's really impressive, I have to say.
That's much better than I expected. That's not a bash on the EU. It's just that I've never seen such a pretty looking comparison between the licenses before.
Yeah, I found it impressive when I saw it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, this is obviously, there's a degree of interpretation here. Can you actually modify the underlying source code?
Yes.
Have they made the actual?
It seems there's no information about licensing and availability of the source code.
Right.
I think we'd have to ask them. But if we could get it off them under any license, it would be useful for companies to be able to take this and put it internal with their own interpretation adjustments.
That's exactly my thinking. Just on that, I think there was also the Finos Playbook, which has a similar.
I'm going to add 2 more licenses to the compare. I wonder if now, Sebastian, you made a good point. There doesn't seem to be a way to submit licenses here. And they're missing.
Yeah, you're right there. I do have a email address though I found for the a contact address for this site.
Okay, that's a good
Patrice
start.
Emmanuel Schmidt. I'll put that in the Zoom chat. Obviously, it might be private for the stream, but that's the email address which I found on this European Union website.
That could be really useful. Right.
And feel free to CC me or other SPDX people here, because we've had a look at this in the past and thought that it would be good to have machine readable data from this.
Yes. I just noticed that they are missing, for instance, the Mulan license from China. Yeah, so they do perhaps need more additions.
It would really be useful to have it as somewhere where people can contribute to it.
Yes, because it's a very nice looking interface. And the interpretation side, we'd have to be careful to always say this is someone else determining. I love the idea, Sammy, that if the source code was made available, everyone can do their own interpretation as they need, but they have a really nice foundation to start. I've just opened the FinOS page that Sammy posted, and I'm just going to add this to our comment.
This one, by the way, is a version of what we use internally within ARM. We had it's slightly different, but the principle is exactly the same. So it was work that Jelaine started while she was at ARM before she moved, and we continued to expand on it. But the Finos version was obviously one that went public.
Now that is very interesting.
That looks very good indeed, and it has a contribute link. So there we go.
Ahead of the game.
Yes. I am not sure it has changed significantly, to be honest with you, since the launch. So we certainly have expanded on ours, and there is an issue with the contribution. I think initially it used to be it used to have a CLA, which unfortunately ARM would not accept, so we were not able to contribute. But I have not checked since Finos sort of is more closely aligned with the Linux Foundation, whether that has changed now.
Yes, I will have a look too. I haven't had much interaction with the Finos project myself. No particular reason for that. We just don't bump into each other much.
But it would be useful, Shane, if we can influence the change from the CLA, because we would be more than happy to contribute
Yes.
some of what we've done locally within ARM.
That would be great. Do you recall what the main problem with the CLA was?
I don't remember off the top of
Okay.
my head. I just remember that we couldn't. It was just too wide, and I don't remember the exact details.
Okay, that's a good action item. And I was just looking at their membership. 28% are banks, which is nice.
Yeah, as the name suggests, they're focused on finance. So
Yes. And yeah, I'm just seeing who's on the membership. We've got GitHub, which gives us a good connection. We've got Intel, Red Hat, SUSE, Wipro, official open chain partner, Canonical. Thing. So we've got a few people that we know, not so many.
When did Wipro become an open chain partner?
Oh, they've been an open chain partner for about 8 months now.
Ah, great! Because just a couple of months ago they became SPDX supporters as well, which is quite nice.
It was via Andrew's team that we had the connection with Wipro initially, and yeah.
In the future, we would join SPDX, open chain, and whatever project in one thing, because everyone is part of everything.
As they should be. So I'm just going to jump. This is the Finos document. I'm just jumping to their display of artistic license. No, it's very similar to what we saw with the EU, though it's harder to parse. I wonder what this stuff means. I'm just going to jump up to try to work out what that stuff means.
Would be interesting to actually see if the database is
unmodified chain. It's unmodified binary, modified binary, and unmodified source code and modified source code.
It looks like this handbook is fundamentally compatible with the data in the EU one as well. Slightly smaller scope of the data, but similar. So if we could get hold of the EU stuff, we could potentially have a drop-down tab, EU1, FINOS1, so people could go through.
I think probably the one item here on the FINOS one that doesn't have, which the EU one has, is the comparison. I think that's a very useful tool to have.
Yes, absolutely.
So it looks as if the Finos one has 37 odd licenses, and the EU one had 51. So quite a lot of overlap as well.
Should be, yeah. And looking at, I'm just going through the data structure again. Some parts of it, I think, are just copy paste to get the comparisons. If we could use the EU code. Some parts are descriptive, so it would be more difficult, but not impossible. It would just be an interpretation of the interpretation. Okay, so FINOS, it's the CLA we have to consider. The EU, let's see how they feel about sharing their code. And let's not forget that all of this data is subjective, so we can't rely on anything as a canonical source. What's your opinion about how companies would feel about getting license lists, but being told that you have to choose what interpretation you follow? Do you think companies might feel intimidated by that? how could we phrase it so the companies feel okay with that approach? I know it's not certainty, but we can't offer certainty.
I mean, I always go with here's an example interpretation rather than, because you don't want to be on the hook for sort of misguiding people if they take it as is and use it. I think that has always been, for example, in the during some of the conferences where people try to sort of come up with wording that aligns in terms of how you do indemnities and warranties relating to open source. There was always hesitancy sort of and reluctance because people were worried that they would be providing legal advice. So I personally would opt with the option of just saying, here's an example interpretation.
Yes. That's a good point. And the last thing OpenChain wants to do is to take liability for any license interpretation, especially given the fact that what the license means in Spain, for instance, the GPL, I've been informed, in Spain is often understood as a contract versus how it's generally interpreted in the US.
That's right.
And I have been notified of a very bold claim that almost all open source licenses have liability in Australia, as you're not allowed to disclaim all responsibility, as many open source licenses do. So that might be something to look into further.
Yes.
And I mean, Australians clearly do use open source, so so it's not as if they're completely cut out, but that's quite an extreme difference there, if I am to believe what I've been told.
Ooh, Yari pointed out TLDR legal, which I should have pointed out, given I was talking with Kevin 4 days ago. I forgot. So TLDR legal has interpretations as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, that could be one source as well, which is, at least something I've been using sometimes.
Yeah, it's been around a while now. I remember when Kevin first showed it, God, it was 8 years ago or something.
Mm.
So this kind of took the Creative Commons approach, I think would be one way to describe it. Sebastian, take care, be well, and thank you very much. Just to Sebastian's point about liability in Australia, in Japan, it's scoped by industry. So smart infrastructure like smart homes, the company's liable. If you reinstall open source with a modification, they're still liable for the product. So that's why DRM is very important for IoT here. Just by example, my house is just full of Panasonic IoT stuff. And I know my air conditioners are running Linux, and so is my solar thing. But if I blow it up and set fire to my house, Panasonic is liable by messing with the code. Not if I, blow it up in some other creative manner. Right, I'm just going to add TLDR. Well, I think we've covered pretty much everything we can cover in a live interaction. And certainly it looks like we have some exciting stuff on helping people scope license interpretation. The last item is just a request. If you're from a medium company or have experience in medium companies, please consider putting comments to just make sure what we've written here matches. And we will have another meeting about the playbooks probably in 2 weeks to review what the Japanese groups have brought back with their assessment of how realistic the medium company plan is.
Before we go, if that's the idea, can I ask why was this scenario picked for the medium company? The scenario where they ship a motherboard for an embedded system. Why this specifically?
Yeah, so the reason that this was picked specifically is because the most frequent visible errors in the supply chain tend to come around embedded in consumer electronics with the extreme speed of products to market. So we have, very few hard numbers on this, but we have a lot of reports from companies doing embedded in consumer electronics that their supply chains are very challenging. But the hope was that this medium company example, which is combining hardware and software, people could also read into it and, think, oh, I'm only doing software, but most of this applies to me too.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. To be completely honest, I had to digest, this process that you came up with for this specific scenario, because as far as I'm concerned, again, this is just my situation coming from a purely software medium company. It's not exactly the way it happened for us. So I needed to go through the steps and see whether this is feasible for another company that doesn't have our specific industry. And I think it makes sense. I think I'm going to go through the playbook again, just to make sure I'm not missing anything. But yeah, so I was just curious about that, and if we need to maybe take a broader approach, or but I think this seems to work well for this scenario. Okay,
and
thank you.
If you see something that's very different from your learned experience, or even slightly different, if you could leave a comment,
okay,
that would be useful. Because right now we're getting one playbook for each company, small, medium, and large. But over time, we'd hope to include multiple companies with multiple company types.
Okay, I will. I think the one thing that really stood out for me was, I guess, the lack of prior communication about open source compliance within the company. So it sounds like, legal and engineering and the business groups were all doing their thing, and they weren't necessarily communicating with respect to a possible, open source policy or with respect to open source compliance.
Yes.
And at least what happened in our case was that, as the company started growing, we began receiving questions from customers about open source compliance, or we had to negotiate open source license clauses in the agreements. And that's when the conversation began between legal and engineering. It's not necessarily when a policy was set in place. That usually happens much later. There's a process that takes place, the beginnings of a compliance process before a policy actually, is drafted and approved, and everything. So there is this communication between the departments before compliance is actually achieved, which it doesn't sound like that's the case for this scenario, but I do see it to be realistic. So it's not like, there is this gap between legal and engineering and the business teams when it comes to open source compliance. So I'm not saying it's impossible. It's just, it's not our scenario. So I need to look into it a bit more to see if it's really feasible or if it's overseeing something.
No, that's really, really good feedback. And thank you very much for taking the time on that. We will be able to build further playbooks, and your real world feedback is critical, as Gary pointed out. It's something we really need.
So I agree with Valentina. Actually, from our own experience, I think yes, I think there is always initiatives being done by certain groups or subgroups within an organization. I think what is quite interesting is that there's a huge degree of inconsistency. In our case, it was between one business group and another. almost like sort of silo type effect where it was just done very differently, or understanding of what compliance means was quite different. And it wasn't until we had a sort of a more centralized approach that we started to sort of go back and say, oh, hang on a second, we need to write a policy that applies to everyone. so we almost started with, we were doing some compliance and then went back and said, actually, we need a policy, and then we need a consistent process across the organization. So that for us was a big challenge, because you know, with a company of, I don't know, 7,000-8,000 employees, and different types of products, from software to combined software and hardware to combined sort of microprocessor design. We wanted something that is scalable and meets all the needs.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah, that kind of brings, kind of like what Sami was just saying, that I don't know if it's feasible for these playbooks, but what happens when there's M&A and the different types of companies get merged together? Yeah. I don't know if that's worth another playbook.
Oh, undoubtedly. I think it would be. I mean, I guess at some point, one of our things will be to make a shopping list of which playbooks need to be made first. But I mean, we're looking at tens of thousands of companies in the supply chain. We need a lot of information.
So the only other thing that is worth thinking about, Shane, is actually, and I think you and I spoke about this before, we talk about companies, but I would also like to promote actually project-based compliance, because that is completely different type of engagement, I think, to be consistent across a certain project, or to get a project fully up to a compliance level.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. And, you know, now that we have Eclipse Foundation conformant, it's the right time.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, and then in a shopping list, you know, all the, you know, like Eclipse Foundation or other non-profits.
Yes. Yeah, we might be able to bring in Eclipse to help us with that. I'll reach out to Mike. Alrighty, we have plans, we have a time scale. We'll come back to this for the next global meeting in 2 weeks. Thank you, everyone. This was really productive, and have a wonderful, wonderful day.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.